When last we were together, we looked at the domestic policy of Dwight Eisenhower. And while his domestic policy was successful and he oversaw one of the most robust economies of the United States since the 1920s, it's really in foreign policy that Dwight Eisenhower came to be better known. And in fact, Eisenhower's policies in the modern era, and politics goes into this Democrat versus Republican, Republican versus Democrat, Eisenhower's always been looked upon as the sleepy granddad that really didn't do a lot. And yet, his administration was one of the most important in developing the policies and or maintaining the policies of previous administrations. In 1952, as Dwight Eisenhower is running for the presidency, as we saw in the previous video, Dwight Eisenhower ran on a platform calling, as most candidates do, for peace and prosperity. You know, it's irony. Most politicians don't run on a platform of, I'm going to wreck the economy and get us into wars. Politicians run on what sells to the American people, and the American people want to be well paid, have things to buy, go about their lives, be left alone, and be safe. And so Eisenhower had run on a policy of prosperity and peace. But he also, because the 1950s, 1952 as he's running, the Korean War is still going on. America's facing challenges not only from the Soviet Union, but from China, and there seems to be problems around the world. Eisenhower and his hand-picked future Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, would look at the world and they would see, especially Dulles, for instance, would see the world as an arena in which the forces of good and evil were continually at war. Dulles was a moralist, and Ike had that streak in him as well. And Eisenhower stated during the campaign, he said, "We can never rest until the enslaved nations of the world have in the fullness of freedom the right to choose their own path. For then and only then can we say that there is a possibility or any possible way of living peacefully and permanently with communism in the world." Eisenhower is in essence saying Stalin has set his agenda, and Stalin says we want peace, but look at enslaved Eastern Europe. Look at the nations being held to the Soviet Union by force. We can't trust him. Only once freedom has progressed into Eastern Europe and Asia, can we say that communism and capitalism can peacefully coexist. Otherwise, it's all window dressing. You can say that you want peace all day long, but until you see the fruits of it, there's nothing there. And so Eisenhower is going to run on a platform that says containment of the Truman years was needlessly defensive. And think about containing. It's not pushing back communism. It's not liberating. It's not bringing freedom and peace to the world. It's containing the growth. And thus containment is a defensive strategy, not an offensive strategy. That doesn't mean that we weren't in wars. Look at Korea. Look at Berlin. Although Berlin wasn't a war, it came awful close. It's needlessly defensive in the words of Eisenhower. Eisenhower believed that containment implied a commitment to the status quo. that we were continually going to be locked in a loop of maintaining and yet not changing the world. And so Eisenhower fundamentally believed America should work toward liberation of Eastern Europe from Soviet domination. John Foster Dulles would refer to containment as, in his words, a treadmill policy. And I quote, which at best might perhaps keep us in the same place until we drop exhausted, end quote. He said it costs far too much in taxes and I quote again, was not designed to win victory conclusively. And so for how long are you willing to maintain the status quo? And so the 1952 Republican platform promised to, and I quote, repudiate all commitments such as the Yalta Agreement, which aid communist enslavement, and it promised to end the negative, futile, and immoral policy of containment, which abandons countless human beings to despotism and godless terrorism, end quote. And so Eisenhower and Dulles are going to commit their administration to a policy of changing the national standard of containment. Here's the whole thrust of today's lecture. And by the way, it will be the thrust of the next lecture on Kennedy. And it will be the thrust of the next lecture on Johnson and the Vietnam War. And then on Nixon and on Carter and on, ultimately, Reagan. Containment not only is not changed, but Eisenhower does more to bolster and institutionalize containment than had even Truman. While not calling it containment, while calling it an aggressive foreign policy, and Dulles is going to use new words. In fact, as a diplomatic historian, Dulles added new words to the American vocabulary, such as liberation, rolling back communism, brinkmanship, mutually assured destruction, things like that. Dulles adds to the national lexicon. So instead, as they envision a foreign policy of liberation, and as Dulles says, liberation, and I quote, will inevitably set up strains and stresses within the captive world, which will make the rulers impotent to continue in their monstrous ways and mark the beginning of the end. I really think, and we'll show this as we get into it, I think they missed an opportunity here to accomplish exactly what Dulles says. Dulles said, it will set up strains and stresses within the captive world that will make the rulers impotent and will mark the beginning of the end. And that came close to happening. But the United States, because of distractions elsewhere, and the American people not really having the commitment to liberate Eastern Europe, dropped the ball. And at the key moment when this could have happened, we fall back to containment, and that remains the status quo. It won't be until the 1980s and Ronald Reagan kind of brings this back, reawakens and reanimates the idea of rolling back communism. And he does put such stresses and strains on the communist world that it fractures and ultimately falls apart. Now, Ike and Dulles, as they laid out their foreign policy, were quick to clarify that they didn't mean a hot war. They don't mean going to war to liberate Eastern Europe. They instead mean indirect pressure. So what kind of indirect pressure? Well, as we talked about, Harry Truman had created the Central Intelligence Agency, and it would be under the Eisenhower administration. The 1950s are kind of the golden age of the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, it would be Allen Welsh Dulles, who is the brother of John Foster Dulles, who's the Secretary of State. Allen Welsh Dulles will be kind of the man of the hour. He's the golden child that presents Eisenhower with an alternative. And I don't mean to sound cruel and insensitive, nor do I think it's always right for American foreign policy to fundamentally transform and change other countries to bend them to our will. But that is kind of the nature of the history of the world. Nations try to change the globe to reflect their interest and their goals. The Germans have a saying for this called Realpolitik. That's how it functions in the real world. And Allen Dulles provided his brother John Foster Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower with an alternative to boots on the ground, hot war, fundamental change of other countries. And it would be in 1953 that the first use of what we will later call the new look in American military and foreign policy, new look, a transformation from the old NSC-68 tanks and artillery and buildup of conventional forces, kind of a reverting back to the old order of we have the bomb and we're not afraid to use it. And the new look having fundamental bombers and delivery systems capable of hitting countries around the world. And Eisenhower ultimately has that big stick of the nuclear bomb and later the hydrogen bomb to threaten, to control, to bring nations to their will. But something short of that, something short of the battlefield, Eisenhower is reluctant to commit troops. And so in 1953, in what was called Operation Ajax, the United States would use the CIA to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, before you get all upset and point out that your book and perhaps other sources spell Mossadegh different than I didn't misspell it. There are 3 or 4 different ways to spell Mossadegh. I chose one. So you can see this with different variations of spelling. But Mohammad Mossadegh was a 70-year-old Iranian nationalist who had come under Soviet influence. He was Prime Minister of Iran. He was certainly working with the Tudeh, Tudeh, that was the Iranian Communist Party. And while not openly a communist, he was certainly doing things in Iran that pushed toward communism. And as he pushed further and further toward communism, the United States, Eisenhower, wanted to change the regime in Iran. And the Shah of Iran, who was the nominal figurehead, leader of Iran, had been forced into exile by the rise of Mossadegh and his rival parties. But where it really really kind of crossed over and demonstrated, and I know there are sites out there in attacking the United States that the United States was acting in the interest of oil, kind of the boogeyman of the left. Anytime that oil is involved, that has to be the cause. Well, the United States got very little oil from Iran. Britain got most of its oil from Iran. But Mossadegh began nationalizing the Iranian oil fields, Iranian distribution systems, and Iranian refining plants. Nationalizing it, that is a huge step toward communism, rather than the oil fields and oil reserves and oil facilities remaining in private hands, private businesses. The government's taking over. In other words, the government Iran was getting into the oil business. The oil business that other countries and other companies had built. And as Mossadegh nationalized the Iranian oil infrastructure, that proved to be the last straw, and Allen Dulles sends in his top agent, Kim Roosevelt. Kim Roosevelt was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, one of the grandsons. He had many, many, many grandchildren. But Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kim Roosevelt, was one of the top CIA agents, and he was sent into Iran, ironically, with a general that had been instrumental in aiding the Shah of Iran in setting up the Shah of Iran's national police force and secret police after World War II, a general by the name of H. Norman Schwarzkopf, which, for those of you who are familiar with Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm of the 1990s, this would be the father of Norman Schwarzkopf, who will lead the ground assault in Desert Storm. So Kim Roosevelt and General H. Norman Schwarzkopf go into Iran and began providing aid to the supporters of the Shah of Iran, organizing his secret police, distributing money to street protesters, and organizing demonstrations against Mossadegh. In other words, doing in Iran exactly what the communists had been doing in Greece and Turkey before the United States had passed the Greek and Turkish aid bill in the 1940s that had brought about the Truman Doctrine. Well, instead, U.S. CIA goes in and begins distributing money to various anti-Mossadegh groups, which then take to the streets and overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstate the exiled Shah of Iran. Of course, then once the Shah is back in, and much has been made of this, but the Shah, to pay off those who had helped reinstate him, and I know there are people who have fundamental disagreement with this, but the U.S. and Britain got 40% of Iran's oil exports in return. The Dutch got 14%, the French got 6% of Iranian oil production in return for reinstating the Shah. Business got what it wanted, and the government, Eisenhower, got what it wanted. Containment was maintained. Now, once again, that's not rolling back. Mossadegh was headed toward communism, so he hadn't begun to be communist yet. He hadn't attached Iran to the Soviet Union. So this kind of stopped it in its tracks. But yet it's one more instance of containment, not rolling back communism. A second area where the CIA in these early years gained success through regime change was in a second operation called Operation Washtub. Operation Washtub took place in Guatemala, where the president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman had become president in an election, a rigged election, a fraudulent election, an election that he was backed by the communists and using communist tactics had out-frauded those who opposed him. Now, the United States wasn't totally sure whether he was communist or not, but in the words of the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala, he said, and I quote, "Guzman talked like a communist, he thought like a communist, he acted like a communist, and if he's not one, he will do until one comes along." End quote. And so the CIA, through a disinformation campaign, forced Guzman into exile and prevented a communist foothold from being established in the Western Hemisphere in Guatemala. A 1955 committee investigated the actions of the CIA and stated, and I quote, "It's now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of conduct do not apply." End quote. And so, congressional sanction, if you will, for the CIA's activities to prevent the spread of communism. In other words, the use of the Central Intelligence Agency to bolster containment. Now, as we've already talked about, John Foster Dulles thought containment was too passive. But in reality, Eisenhower's administration institutionalized containment by not only continuing it, but by expanding it. Eisenhower is trying to accomplish two things at the same time that sometimes are mutually exclusive. First off, he's trying to balance the budget and maintain economic growth. Yes, through Keynesian economics, i.e. government spending targeted in the economy. But he's trying to get away from that. He's trying to back off from Keynesian economics. But at the same time, he wants to use military and other infrastructure to push back communism. And those can be contradictory. And so due to budget concerns, the Eisenhower administration sought to cut expenditures on conventional forces and expand to more aggressive forms of containment by relying on what Dulles would call massive retaliation and going to the brink, or brinkmanship. Dulles' program, as I told you, was called the New Look, and it reaped the benefits of Truman's expansion, but the administration relied on nuclear superiority, especially with the test and development of the hydrogen bomb. Such a horrific device, and yet a thing of kind of morbid beauty. I remember as a kid, still during the Cold War, they would sometimes disguise it as tornado drills, but we were also performing duck and cover drills in case of nuclear attack. Like hiding under a desk is going to do anything from a hydrogen bomb. Or maybe they made desks in schools better that day, in those days, I don't know. But the United States, this new look in foreign policy, the U.S. would respond to communist threats to its allies not by using conventional forces in local conflicts, but by retaliating instantly and relying on the deterrent of massive retaliatory power, a great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at times of our choosing." End quote. And so Dulles' word for this was brinkmanship, going to the edge, pushing the Soviets to the brink of war in order to exact concessions. It's kind of scary. When asked about this, Dulles, in a Life magazine article, explained what he meant. And I quote again, "You have to take chances for peace, just like you have to take chances in war. Some say that we were brought to the verge of war. Of course we were brought to the verge of war. The ability to get to the verge without getting into the war is the necessary art. If you try to run away from it, if you're scared to go to the brink, you are lost." We've had to look it square in the face. We walked to the brink. We looked it in the face. We took strong action. End quote. Well, what did he mean? Well, one of the first areas that brinkmanship was employed, and I told you this at the time, but I'm going to repeat it. The first place that Dulles and Eisenhower used brinkmanship was in Korea. The North Koreans and the Chinese refused to negotiate on an end to the conflict. Eisenhower went to Korea as president-elect, and then upon becoming president, let it be known that he didn't take nuclear weapons off the table, that he was willing to use any means at disposal to win the war. Now, Eisenhower's favorite game was poker, and he was quite good at it. So was he bluffing? I don't know. But neither did the Chinese. And so the Chinese, especially when Eisenhower began moving bombers capable of delivering atomic weapons to Chinese and North Korean targets, were moved into areas, and we made sure that Chinese spies knew those units were moved. Only then did China and North Korea go to the bargaining table. Yet another area where brinkmanship was practiced was in Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits. You see on the map a picture of mainland China, that's now communist China, and the island of Formosa, now the nation of Taiwan, that is the Republican Chinese, our ally, Chiang Kai-shek. And as the Chinese began saber-rattling about taking Taiwan, Dulles and Eisenhower responded by closer ties with Taiwan. But then in 1954, in what was known as the First Taiwan Strait Crisis, and obviously when you put first on there, that means there were more than one. They'll be back. But the Chinese began gathering a fleet and an invasion force to take the two islands that I've marked, Matsu and Quemoy, that were still held by Republican Chinese forces at the mouth of two Chinese ports. And the Communist Chinese, viewing this as a national affront, that the Republican Chinese not only still existed, but they occupied those islands, were moving to eradicate them. In 1954, Eisenhower dispatches the U.S. Navy forces to the South China Sea, with U.S. Navy ships escorting Taiwanese freighters and Taiwanese ships, and the U.S. Navy being interposed between China and Taiwan. when the Chinese began bombarding those islands, Eisenhower and Dulles let it be known that they would use nuclear retaliation if those islands were taken, saying that the U.S. forces were moved into the South China Sea, and I quote, both to deter any Red Chinese attack against Indochina and to provide weapons for instant retaliation, end quote. And so with the Taiwan crisis averted by interpositioning of the American fleet, and then the United States and Taiwan signing a defensive pact tying Taiwan to the United States, the U.S. then negotiated an end to the Taiwan crisis by signing agreements with China. And in a strange twist, China, in its agreement to preserve Quemoy-Matsu and leave Taiwan alone, reserve the right to bombard the islands every other day. They're not going to attack every day, but every other day they reserve the right to bombard those islands. It was a concession. Eisenhower went along with it, and it was maintained until the second Taiwan Strait crisis a few years later. Dulles's new look also applied to tying the world together into defensive pacts. So you see, growing from his relationship with Taiwan, his defensive agreement with Taiwan, we already have a defensive agreement with South Korea. We have a defensive arrangement with Japan. But next, he moves to create an equivalent for NATO, and I think that's the key here. You have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that Truman put together. We have NATO tying Europe together, but it's the North Atlantic, so it stretches across to Canada, the United States, to Alaska. So then use your agreements with Japan and South Korea and now Taiwan, and move that into the South Pacific. And now with the new treaty, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which the media loving the use of acronyms, even though this isn't the official name of the treaty, it's what stuck. So SEATO, because it went along with NATO. So SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, tied the United States, Great Britain, France, all of whom have interests in Southeast Asia, all of whom are tied to the region by colonial claims, but they're tied into a defensive pact with Taiwan, with Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and, of course, the green flag with the crescent moon, Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, as you can see, takes us all the way to the edge of the Middle East. And so tying the Pacific realm together with a defensive pact to insulate and isolate the Soviet Union from expansion in the Pacific. And then following that with the Central Treaty Organization, this treaty was known as the Baghdad Pact. But the media wanting to maintain the NATO SEATO, they called it the Central Treaty Organization, and thus CENTO. Another part of this, the Baghdad Pact was sometimes called MITO, the Middle East Treaty Organization. But MITO quickly fell out of use, and CENTO was the preferred an acronym. So you have the United States, Great Britain, and then tying it to Pakistan. So you see the tie there, bringing Pakistan into both defensive circles. Pakistan, Turkey being on the edge of NATO, Iran, Iraq, and then the United States and Great Britain. And thus the United States has made a worldwide chain of defensive agreements. Dulles flew some 500,000 air miles in cementing these alliances based on the format of NATO, although they were all weaker, and very quickly, CENTO especially will fall apart. But nonetheless, it's that new look to hold the line, and then the idea in their mind at least was from this beginning to push back in rolling back the communist aggression. Instead, what this is doing is it is confirming and establishing the lines of containment that already existed. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and after a year of struggling to replace, in 1955, July of 1955, the new Soviet leader, Premier Nikita Khrushchev, will meet with President Eisenhower. So in the picture you see President Eisenhower on the right, then Nikita Khrushchev, then Mamie Eisenhower, and then Mrs. Khrushchev on the far, so from right to left, on the far left is Mrs. Khrushchev. Khrushchev undertook a series of, you might say, a Stalin apology tour, apologizing at least within the USSR for the extremes of Joseph Stalin. They would call it de-Stalinization. But that doesn't make Khrushchev any less of a committed communist. In fact, it makes him more of a dangerous communist because he's far more subtle. And I put his famous quote up there. And some have seen in this application to modern day and our slide toward communism, whatever. But nonetheless, he saw that baby steps had to be taken to undermine the United States. We cannot expect the Americans to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving Americans small doses of socialism. What is that? Well, it's state control of various aspects of the economy and society until they suddenly wake up to find they have communism, state control of everything. And so Khrushchev understood incrementalism, and it's what he sought to, his approach to the United States. But at the same time, in Eastern Europe, he's pulling back from, you might say, the sins of the past. So in July of 1955, the leaders of the United States, Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain met in Geneva, Switzerland, and that's where these pictures were taken, in Geneva, Switzerland, where the two met, and it was hailed as the greatest meeting since Potsdam, the new meeting of the wartime alliance. And Eisenhower shocks the world by giving a speech called the Open Skies speech, in which he calls upon the Soviet Union to open up its airspace. That the United States would open up its airspace, the Soviet Union open up its airspace, they could have genuine consensus and agreement, and the United States and the Soviet Union could verify each other's armaments by overflights, and thus they could work toward reducing not only their nuclear stockpiles and atomic stockpiles, but disarmament as well. That the United States wasn't going to have peace treaties that it couldn't verify, especially when it came to atomic missiles and military preparedness. Khrushchev was livid, stating that this was a very transparent attempt for the United States to engage in espionage. He said that overflying the Soviet Union would give the United States information that they didn't already have, while overflights of Soviet craft over the United States would provide little they didn't already know. Why? Well, because the KGB was far more effective than the CIA operating in the other's nation. In fact, the CIA will be highly effective on the periphery of the Soviet Union, but inside the Soviet Union, it would have great difficulty because of the tight-woven, long-established control of the KGB. The KGB operated quite easily in the United States. And so the open skies agreement. Eisenhower gives really two famous speeches during his presidency. The first was Atoms for Peace. As he first came into the presidency, he proposed that the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain all turn over their nuclear arsenals to a UN group, the Atomic Energy Commission, and let the Atomic Energy Commission control all the nuclear stockpiles and basically do away with nuclear weapons. The world just stood in awe. Of course, the Soviet Union said not only no, but hell no. And so Atoms for Peace kind of fell apart, and the left has always derided Eisenhower's speech as he was just propagandizing. He wasn't really serious. But on the other side of that, his second famous speech, Open Skies, had some merit. In fact, Eisenhower was just about a year too early because shortly after this, the U.S. develops probably one of the most advanced spy planes of the day, the U-2 spy plane, and the United States began overflights of the Soviet Union anyway, high enough that the Soviets couldn't reach it. Well, till later. This becomes a source of embarrassment for Eisenhower later in his presidency. But U-2 spy planes, and then after that, satellites. So Eisenhower is kind of ahead of the game here in proposing it, but it was met with derision from Khrushchev. And while the leaders of the nations go home to return to supposed peace and prosperity, the spirit of Geneva reigning, in fact, it proved that all was not well. 1956 is an election year. And in fact, let me jump ahead because events happened during the election. And so let me introduce the election first. This is basically a repeat of 1952. The only thing that changes is Adlai Stevenson's vice presidential nominee. 1952, two bald-headed guys running against each other. Chrome Dome 1, this is Chrome Dome 2. But Eisenhower versus Adlai Stevenson. Richard Nixon's, Eisenhower thought about dumping Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon was extremely popular with especially anti-communists, and so Richard Nixon was by necessity kept on the ticket. Adlai Stevenson, needing to kind of bolster his image in the South, chose Tennessean Estes Kefauver, but it didn't do any good. Election day was miserable again because Adlai Stevenson got an even worse whipping than he got the first time around. And so Eisenhower confirmed in his presidency, and with minor changes in his cabinet. But while the campaign is going on through 1956, two events occur that seem to show cracks in the edifice. The first was the Suez Crisis of 1952. A little bit of backstory on this. The French and the British had joint ownership of the Suez Canal, but Britain had, over the centuries since it had been constructed, had gained more and more shares of the canal, and Britain, in essence, owned the Suez Canal. And Port Said, which controls the going in and out of the canal. In Egypt, King Farouk of Egypt had been overthrown and had been ousted by General Gamal Abdel Nasser, whom you see in the upper right. Nasser had come to power in 1952, and as he consolidated power, as are most of these leaders, he is extreme Egyptian nationalist. And one of his bones of contention was British control of the Suez Canal. And so he begins pushing for British removal from the Suez Canal. Britain saw the Suez Canal as vital to links to its Asian colonies. Eisenhower and Dulles, in kind of an odd move, began supporting Nasser in his calls for the removal of Great Britain from the control of the Suez Canal. Now, that seems odd with Britain as our staunchest ally, but in the global scheme of things, Britain's need for the canal had dwindled. Only Britain didn't really see it yet. But there are two factors in the United States working and supporting Eisenhower in his move to return the Suez Canal to Egyptian control. One is the fear of southern cotton farmers that as Egypt uses revenue, which Nasser stated is he was going to use revenue from the Suez Canal for other projects, that Egyptian cotton would compete with U.S. cotton on the open market. And Eisenhower wants Egypt as an ally. He's trying to stave off communist expansion, especially as Britain digs in. But in 1954, under pressure from Eisenhower, Britain and Egypt sign a treaty calling for Britain's withdrawal in 20 months from the Suez Canal. So as the clock begins ticking, Nasser declares that he also wants support in constructing a hydroelectric dam, the Aswan Dam, a major undertaking. It needed a lot of funding. And he turns to the United States. The United States initially says it will support the construction of the Aswan Dam, which of course creates fears in Israel, which is an American ally. But nonetheless, the United States is moving toward supporting the Aswan Dam construction until Nasser begins trading more goods and opening up Egyptian markets to Soviet goods. Suddenly, Dulles changes his mind, cancels the loan agreement, and this angers Nasser. He seizes the Suez Canal, driving the British out early, using the revenue from the Suez Canal to fund the Aswan Dam project. With all of this backstory, in 1956, Israel suddenly launches an offensive in the Sinai Peninsula, pushing down the Sinai Peninsula and taking most of the Sinai Peninsula and pushing the Egyptians back into Egypt proper, but stopping 10 miles short of the Suez Canal. Now, it later turns out that the Israelis had been funded and pushed by the British and the French to launch this offensive. And the British and French used the crisis of Israel and Egypt fighting near the Suez Canal for Britain and France to seize the Suez Canal to keep it safe from the warring parties. And in this risky move that Eisenhower hadn't even been aware of, October 29, 1956, the Israelis invade the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, and the British and French occupy the Suez Canal. You see the dates, October 29th. So October through November, as the Suez crisis is going on that threatens to explode across the Middle East, Eisenhower's put in an uncomfortable position of taking the side of the Egyptians. He can either support the American allies and go against the UN Charter and America's agreements with Egypt, or he can do the right thing and support the Egyptians and stand against our allies. Eisenhower's a man of integrity, and so he opposes the British, the French, the Israelis, threatens to cut off U.S. subsidies to all three, and to even boycott their goods. Britain and France back down, return the Suez Canal to Egypt. Israel stands down. The Soviet Union, ironically, who was in this case on the side of the United States, claimed credit for the ceasefire. And so Khrushchev gains glory that rightly should have gone to Eisenhower. But the whole mess covers up a huge crisis elsewhere in the world that could have fundamentally transformed Eisenhower's foreign policy and changed the Western world. At the same time as the Suez crisis is exploding on the world, just days before, the Hungarian Revolution begins. Now, the Hungarian Revolution was made possible by Khrushchev himself. As he begins this de-Stalinization program, he allows the satellite countries, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all to hold more free elections and modify their socialism, stating that there was many routes to the communist objective, and that each nation had to choose its own way. And so in Poland, for instance, Poland would be the first to explore changes, and Władysław Gomulka, a Polish nationalist, became leader of the Polish Communist Party. And he broke openly with a number of Soviet policies, but he was still a good, loyal communist. And Poland kind of underwent a Polish renaissance within the communist state. And because of Poland's success, in October of 1956, Hungary would also engage in a similar movement. In Hungary, Chairman Imre Nagy would become leader of the Communist Party in Hungary, but he was even more for change and westward leaning than even Gomulka in Poland. And so as Nagy came to power in Hungary, Soviet troops pull out of Hungary, leaving Hungary to its own devices. You can see what then followed. As Soviet troops pulled out, Nagy then announces that Hungary is going to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. Statues of Stalin are pulled down and defaced. The hammer and sickle are cut off of the Hungarian flag. That's why the big circle there that's cut out. You can see the flag actually hanging from the building. Well, Nagy went too far. And while broadcasting to the West that Hungary was being transformed, that Hungary was ready for freedom, that they were ready for Eisenhower and the United States to roll back communism in Hungary and live up to their preaching, that Hungary was ripe for change, Suez Crisis is going on in the Middle East. While the world's distracted in the Middle East, Khrushchev's tanks roll back into Hungary, and Imre Nagy is isolated. In fact, one of the saddest things you can ever read is the transcript of the last broadcast of Imre Nagy and his supporters from their radio station Holdout, broadcasting that rumors were flying that the Americans were on the way and that they were trying to hold out until the Americans got there. Please hurry. There were no Americans on the way. While talking about rolling back communism, the United States isn't going to take a step like that would risk war with the Soviet Union. And so instead, Khrushchev moves back into Hungary, clamps down on the revolution. A more compliant leader, János Kadar, is put in place. Nagy's taken back to the Soviet Union, and in Moscow in 1958, he stood in front of a firing squad and executed. And so Eisenhower's foreign policy, while not getting the United States in a war, it is not furthering and not expanding. It's not rolling back communism like Dulles' high-sounding rhetoric. Then on October 4th, 1957, the world changed yet again as the Soviets announced that they had launched the first satellite. So here you have Hungarian revolutions failing. It seems that communism is on the ascendancy again. You have Egypt possibly going communist because of the success of Nasser in Egypt and the closer alliances he's building with the Soviet Union. And it seems very much for Eisenhower that the wheels are coming off of the wagon, and then the Soviets launched the first man-made satellite into orbit. Now Sputnik, a fellow traveler, Sputnik is an abbreviation of the Cyrillic fellow traveler of Earth. On October 4, 1957, it didn't do much, but it was more than the United States had done. This simply orbited the Earth, and in fact, American radio stations would tune in to Sputnik's frequency, and as it went over, you could hear it beep, 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 and they would track it across the heavens. At night with a pair of binoculars, if you knew the orbit, you could watch it go over. In fact, I was out the other night. You can sit out on, I live out in the country, sit out on a nice, dark, clear night, especially in wintertime, and you can watch, even with the naked eye, you can watch the satellites go overhead if the lighting is right, and it's an amazing thing. Well, suddenly, America lived in terror. The Soviets were ahead of us. There was a perceived missile gap everywhere, that the Soviets were ahead of us in rocketry, they were ahead of us in nuclear weapons, they were ahead of us in military. They seemed to be outsmarting us. That with the death of Stalin, that Khrushchev was a cagey character. In fact, the United States successfully launched their first satellite, Explorer 1, January 31st, 1958. It did a little more than Sputnik, but it created in the United States what was known as the Sputnik syndrome. Everybody became paranoid. And so what the fallout from Sputnik was that in the schools, the National Defense Education Act was passed, which emphasized math and science. In typical American fashion, we dumped millions, if not billions of dollars into math and science and all of the national defense disciplines. And of course, the more money we dump into something, the worse we seem to perform. But nonetheless, it encouraged the growth of defense education. In addition to that, the United States expanded its missile program, even offering American missile technology to other nations. And you can see that the missiles, the PGM-19 IRBMs, offered to NATO countries, were accepted by Italy and Turkey. And then the PGM-17 deployed to Great Britain, all nuclear-tipped independent reentry ballistic missiles that could hit the Soviet Union. That is key. In just a few short years, we're going to see the Soviet Union building missile bases off of our shores in Cuba. And when the United States under Kennedy explodes in this overreaction of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev is taken by surprise. He's like, wait a minute, you're upset that we have missiles that can hit you from Cuba? You've got missiles in Turkey, Sputnik syndrome, those missiles implanted in Turkey that can hit the Soviet Union. I don't understand your hypocrisy. So this reaction to Sputnik is going to put us in an uncomfortable position further down the road. Also, in an examination of the national defense industries, it was seen that there was a hodgepodge of different agencies and organizations that were involved in rocketry, and they were all brought together under one heading, NASA, the National Association, the National Administration for Space Administration, National Association of Space Administration or something like that. National Aeronautical and Space Administration, there it is. All designed to coordinate the development of American rocketry. That's just the beginning of conflict with the Soviet Union. As events in Hungary, as events in the Suez play out, Eisenhower states what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, in which the United States promised to extend economic and military aid to any Middle East nation and to use armed forces if necessary to assist those nations against armed aggression from any communist country. And so the United States actively moving into a role in the Middle East and putting the nation in a position that could involve us in conflict. Another problem that was festering was Berlin, and especially West Berlin was a place that the Western democracies could show off their prosperity. And Berlin was increasingly becoming a sore spot to the Soviet Union. And so in an attempt to address some of the outstanding issues, in May of 1950, let's see, what year is this? May of 1959, Khrushchev comes to the United States. Nixon had gone to the Soviet Union and visited with Khrushchev. Khrushchev came to the United States and toured the United States, met with President Eisenhower at Camp David, and they were working out some of these agreements, especially Berlin. And so they decided to call a summit meeting, the Paris Summit, for May of 1960. This Paris Summit is sometimes called the U2 Summit, not to be confused with the rock band U2, but the U2 Summit was to be a state meeting between the United States and the Soviet Union to work out major Cold War differences. Instead, as the summit started, Khrushchev began questioning Eisenhower on the issue of spying on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower initially says, we don't do it. Then Khrushchev confronts Eisenhower about U-2 spy plane overflights of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower reluctantly admitted it, and then Khrushchev revealed that the Soviet Union had shot down a U-2 spy plane and had captured the American pilot. Gary Francis Powers, sometimes seen as Francis Gary Powers, on May 1st, 1960, he had been shot down over the Soviet Union and was in Soviet hands. And so the last real chance for reconciling issues between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, the U-2 summit, fell apart and the two went their separate ways. The last major problem of the Eisenhower foreign policy came immediately to our south. January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista, the dictator of Cuba, he was a dictator, but he was a dictator at least sympathetic to the United States, was overthrown by a communist revolutionary. And in the picture in the middle, you can see Fidel Castro with one of his buddies, Che Guevara. In overthrowing the Batista regime, Castro begins nationalizing Cuban resources and begins down that communist road of nationalizing industry, opening up Cuba to Russian oil imports. When American refineries in Cuba refused to refine the Russian oil, Castro nationalized industry, and thus Eisenhower is put in a position of cutting diplomatic relations with Cuba January 3rd, 1961, one of his last acts as president. But what he did do is he put into place a CIA program to begin training Batistaites in Mexico for possible reinsertion into Cuba to overthrow Castro, especially as Castro began holding public executions and cleansing, purging Cuba of political opponents. Eisenhower begins training an insurgent force of Cubans to go back into Cuba. But first off, they weren't ready by the time he left office, and secondly, he didn't think the plan would really work, so he shelves it. But the new president's going to think otherwise. Very quickly, 1960 is an election year. Eisenhower served his 2 terms. He's ready to step aside. He reluctantly supports his vice president, Richard Nixon, for the nomination. The Democrats turn to a young Catholic candidate, John Fitzgerald Kennedy from Massachusetts. Both of them run as ardent Cold Warriors. In an amazing book by Chris Matthews of MSNBC fame, a dual biography of Kennedy and Nixon. These two were not only ideologically compatible, they both, and Kennedy may have even been more stringently anti-communist than Nixon, but they were also good friends. He tells a story of Richard Nixon standing at Kennedy's bedside weeping as Kennedy almost came close to death while they were in the Senate together. So these two were close friends. Unfortunately, politics has the ability to tear friendships apart, and they became bitter enemies and rivals in the 1960 campaign. And we'll talk more about this in the next video. But during this campaign, it was the first nationally televised debate. In the televised debate, Nixon knew more details and more information, but Kennedy looked better. Nixon was recovering from the flu. He was very sick. He was sweating. They had too thick a makeup on. The lights were too hot. Lyndon Johnson, who was in his car listening to the debate, thought Nixon had cleaned the floor with Kennedy, but the TV ratings showed the American public liked Kennedy because he was a nice, good-looking guy. And on Election Day, the nation turned to Kennedy, primarily because of two states, Illinois and Texas, both of which voter fraud was rampant, and if those two states had gone Republican, Nixon would have been president. But instead, Kennedy was elected president because of, as Chris Matthews details, some dirty tricks. Nixon doesn't forget this, that Kennedy's dirty trick department sabotaged him once. When he runs for president again in '68 and then for re-election in '72, he remembers that. And that's what leads him down the road ultimately to Watergate. But that's a story for another day. And so January 1961, the nation has a new president. Let me leave you with this, a quote from Stephen Ambrose on the Eisenhower years. He said, and I quote, "On occasion, the Republicans, Ike and Nixon, rattled the saber, and always they filled the air with denunciations of the communists. But they also shut down the Korean War, cut corporate taxes, and reduced the size of the armed forces. Despite intense pressures and great temptations, they entered no wars. They were willing to supply material on a limited scale to others so they could fight the enemy, but they would not commit American boys to the struggle. Like Truman, they did their best to contain communism. Unlike him, they did not use American troops to do so. They were unwilling to make peace, but they would not go to war. Their speeches provided emotional satisfaction, but their actions failed to liberate a soul." End quote. Next time, we'll see the Kennedy administration.